our July event. No, I'm sorry, our August event. And just a couple of brief announcements and some thank yous. Of course, this is hosted by the Blueberry Patch as well as Neptune Grill. I'd like to thank them and give a few announcements here. The 7th, which is tonight, will be open mic featuring Fuzzy Britches. The 11th will be the open jam with Blueberry Patch's The Ramblers. The 22nd will be to be announced, so you can look on their Facebook page. And every Saturday, Volunteer Day at 11:11 a.m. And what's wonderful about that event is you're cleaning up the place, you have a little lunch, and you get a free pass. So our literary event will be taking a hiatus for September due to the fact that it falls on a holiday week. And so October will be write your own spooky story or poem or such. I think that will be a lot of fun. We'll have November, which will be an open mic. We're going to be featuring Stone Handy, one of our local poets and singer-songwriters. And December will be Dalton Trumbo.
And I forgot to write on there, all three of those will be at the Patch, so everything.
Right, and all three of those will be at the Patch. We also have Keep St. Pete Lit, weekly writing classes, register online, and the City of Imagination, Gulfport, literary meeting every second Wednesday, and that information you can find on Facebook. As we do on occasion, read from Brief English Grammar. A proper noun as a name of a particular individual in a class. So I'll leave you with that, and we will start our event. Harper Lee, of course, as we know, she was born April 28th, 1926 in Monroeville, Alabama. A.C. Lee, fairly successful newspaperman and on-again, off-again attorney and an occasional state legislator. And he served the Alabama state legislature from 1926 to 1938. Well, she was the youngest of four, and her mother is Frances Cunningham Finch. So we have a brief idea of the fact of where she came up with some of the names in her novel. Anyways, there's a couple of interesting things about her father. He had once defended two black men accused of murdering two white storekeepers, father and a son. And what's also very interesting, that the murderers were also a father and a son. Of course, he lost that, and it was two black men on trial and an all-white jury. And of course, they were hanged for the incident. So we see some somewhat similarities to some of her writing. Her siblings were Alice Finch Lee, who died in 2014, Louise Lee Connor, whose husband was a professor at Old Miss, as a literary professor at Old Miss, and a lit professor eventually at Alabama. And then her brother Edwin Lee. Very little, I've tried my darndest to come up with conversational pieces, because she never invited any interview at all in her life. Even when she was doing research with Truman Capote, she was very leery of the press. There was one brief conversation that she had with Dorothy Parker of The New Yorker, and she left that meeting with the final statement as, "What a dreadful human being." So obviously there was no friendship lost there. So She was educated at Monroe County High School and graduated with in 1944. And her interest, she was writing little bits and pieces, and she wrote for the high school newspaper. And of course, we have no evidence of any of her writings from the high school newspaper. I don't know why. There was interestingly enough, there was a burning of County Hall, but that's not where they kept the high school newspaper. So I don't know what that issue was. But she had a real interest in English literature, and she focused a lot of her time on that. And then she attended an all-female college, Huntington College. She was there for a year, and again, she wrote little pieces and little blips and some poetry. And she had readily admitted this to Truman Capote, which is really our only real work of her life, because they were close and they were very tight and fantastic friends. So she went, and Huntington is in Montgomery, Alabama, and then went on to the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And what's interesting about this is that she studied law. She was one of only 2 women at the law school in Alabama. And remember, this law school was just filled with men, and how brave is that? How brave is that? And then wrote for the newspaper at the University of Alabama. Now those little bits and pieces are tangible for us today. And they were bits and kind of special interest articles, human interest articles that maybe sparked something in her. And she did, very interestingly enough, she did comment a great deal on race in America. And I'm sure Peter will be able to expound upon some of those things. Anyways, so all of this was 1945, and after that, she never ended up graduating from Alabama. And in 1949, she moved to New York and took a job as an airline receptionist or a reservation agent, whatever you want to call it. And in her spare time, she wrote a lot of fiction, short stories. Again, we have her talking about that and telling her friends when she was in New York that she had done this, but we have no proof. And again, we have issues with her estate currently, so maybe these things may come out of the woodworks. And from what I've gleaned from all of the newspaper articles and from some of the research, is she probably has 5 to 7 long stories that may have come out of this period of time in her life. But in 1950, she was in the right place at the right time, and she met Michael Brown and Joy Williams. And Michael Brown and Joy Williams, how do I put this? Very well connected within the arts, very well connected within the writer's scene of New York. At the time, I believe he was a lyricist, and he was directing plays. And she was very interested in that whole playwright scene. And Joy Williams eventually became the wife of Michael Brown. And Joy Williams was very close friends with the late Robert Downey Sr. And so from 1950 to 1955, she would basically hang around with this crowd, and she would go, you may or may not know, but Robert Downey Sr. Had his estate in Hyannisport, Mass, which was right next door to the Kennedy estate. And his son, would play with the Kennedy boys. So at this point in time, she got to, when she was there in Hyannisport, got to hang out with a fairly affluential and very interesting New England Catholic family. And families, I should say, because it wasn't just them. Anyways, and of course, she kind of passed around her literature and her writings and said, "Oh, Michael, really, I'd love you to read this." So let me kind of talk a little bit about Michael Brown. Michael Brown was born Mary and Martin Brown II in Texas in 1920. And he died just recently in New York City, I believe November of 2014. But he was a composer, a lyricist, a writer, a director, a producer, a performer, not necessarily in his own works, but in other people's works. And he was very, very well connected. And so, and he eventually married Joy Williams. And they were friends to their death. So what happens in December of 1956? Michael Brown essentially they're of course having a Christmas party, and she's given, essentially receives a gift of a year's wage. And basically the rule is you're not going to work for a year, and you're going to create your masterpiece. And so here's the quote. There were some very interesting people in that room at the time, and there were different variations on the same quote. But I like what Carol Channing said. And Carol Channing said, "You have 1 year off from your job to write whatever you please. Merry Christmas." Now that's what she remembers from that date. Of course, this is an interview that happened in the 90s. And other people had said other things. Truman Capote had worded it a little bit differently with some expletives. So anyways, and at this, eventually in 1956, she meets Harold Arlen, Carol Channing, and Etienne Dupont. And Etienne Dupont, as you know, was the youngest son of the Dupont family, youngest grandson, and he ended up inheriting a vast fortune and spending most of his fortune on writers, because that was his shtick. You need a patron of the arts. He was your man for writing. And there was lots of programs, radio programs, and very, very early television, but movies. And he was quite adamant that America needed to be at the forefront of all of these things. So spring 1957. What does she do spring of 1957? She delivers this enormous manuscript to, I forgot to mention, 1956, she finds an agent. And the agent says, well, you have 2 potential houses that you can go to, publishing houses that you can go to. You can go to J.P. Lippincott, or you can go to Rand. And her meeting at Rand went really badly. So poorly that she cried and said, well, the hell with this writing thing. And then, of course, she was propped up by her friends and said, oh, no, you're being silly, don't do it. Go on to the next place. So she went on to J.B. Lippincott, which is no longer in existence, it's now consumed into, Harper Collins. And she delivers this manuscript, and it's really for To Set a Watchman. It's not for To Kill a Mockingbird. And how do I put this? So she's given at the time, she's given this young woman, junior editor, who we know today as Tay Hoff, but Teresa von Hoffen Torrey, who eventually became senior editor there at J.P. Lippincott. But anyways, they bought the idea. They bought this. They said, there's something here. And so I'm going to read a few quotes. Let's see here. How can I do this? The spark of the true writer is flashed in every line. More genius of... so here's the negative part, is that there's more genius in Antidotes that it's not really a full conceived novel. But she picked out about four pages within a particular chapter. And she said, you have to work on this. This is where the story is. And so from 1957 until 1959, with several rewrites, lots and lots and lots of false starts, millions of edits, and millions of changes of title, she enters her first novel, which is To Kill a Mockingbird. And and suggestions, and editorial guide, and it was just amazing how it just kind of culminated into the final manuscript, which was presented in 1959 and published July 11th, 1960. And what's interesting about this is it became an immediate bestseller. It sat on the New York Times bestseller list for almost the entire decade. That's unheard of. And I mean, sitting in the top 10, the top 15, that's unheard of. Some novels will sit on the bestseller list at 50 for a long time, but it's 50. It's not that's not there. So, very interestingly enough, she got an incredible review by none other than Dorothy Parker from the New Yorker magazine, and said it was the swiftest, kindest deliberation of Southern Gothic material I've ever read. That's a huge compliment, because this woman would tear you apart. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to invite up Martha.
Tijan, this dream's where you belong. Your golden journey now has just begun with your mother's arms.